Hi, everybody. Today is Tuesday, November 11th, 2025, and our friend John Helmer is here with us. Welcome back, John.
Thank you for having me, Nima. Good to be back.
Let's start, John, with the Al Jolani's visit, the Syrian official going to Washington. And I think when you look at the pictures, videos, it's historic. You see the head of Al Qaeda going to Washington, talking with Donald Trump. And here is the picture that shows that Donald Trump is talking, laughing. And what is your understanding of the new move on the part of the Trump administration? And how is that related to what's going on in Syria?
I think that we could headline what we're about to say about Syria and link it to the other conflict zones: Iran, Venezuela, Ukraine, India, and Pakistan. And maybe we'll get some time at the end to talk about some more. We're in a covert operations stage. Let me explain just very quickly, and then we get directly to the Syrian question. At the moment, the Trump orientation of using massive force, the obliteration strategy to change the regime in Iran, has failed and is in suspension, let's say. For one excellent reason, Iran has a deterrent air defense now in coordination with the Russians. First, in Venezuela last week, we heard the administration officials, Rubio, Hegseth, and others, testify behind closed doors, to be sure, but the leak has come, that at the moment, the administration does not believe it has legal justification for attacking land targets in Venezuela. So they're saying at the moment, no legal justification for land targets in Venezuela. That doesn't mean they won't continue to use covert operations to manufacture the reasons. But for the time being, an attack on Venezuela is not imminent. And another reason for that is more effective defense than they want to risk. And we've said this last week in the program. So Venezuela and Iran as regime change targets is in the covert operations phase. Syria is the example of a regime change operation that succeeded. And we're in the stage of covert operations to use the success, essentially the partition of Syria, as we've discussed, between Turkey, the United States, and Israel, to use this stage to develop U.S. policy, and we'll come to that, what that means, and how this meeting of the temporary president of Syria, Ahmad al-Shara or al-Jalani, both names. And we want to see the peculiar way in which the Americans handled him at the White House and in Washington to understand what they think they're doing, and then compare it to the way the Russians handled him when he went to the Kremlin. The degree of openness on the Russian side contrasts very visibly with the peculiar way in which al-Jalani was handled in Washington. Just bear in mind that this isn't the first meeting between Trump and the Syrian leader. There was a meeting in Saudi Arabia with at the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, which was Trump's first announcement of the intention to lift sanctions on Syria and recognize the new leadership of Syria for business as usual. Now, business and money are one of the major US objectives, and you can see that from the pictures, and you can see it in May. Trump refers in May to the appointment of what he called a very good ambassador, a friend of mine who's Lebanese. This is Ambassador Barak, Tom, I believe I got his first name right, Barak, who's of Lebanese origin and is a real estate developer and has been in business with Trump for many years. Barak is officially ambassador to Turkey and special envoy to Syria. He attended and was in the front row of the meeting in the Oval Office that you just showed. Making money in Syria is a major objective. It's a major objective of a private commercial kind, the Barak kind, the Trump kind, and it's a major US, IMF, Saudi objective. Before al-Jilani showed up at the White House, he had met at the IMF with the IMF leadership. And the IMF leadership has issued a number of statements committing Syria in return for the resumption of an IMF program, which would be directed by the US, to privatization, commercialization of its resources, and so forth. The degree of foreign debt that Syria is carrying is difficult to measure because most of its foreign debt is owed to Russia and Iran, and there's no numbers for that. That appears likely to be written off because it's been completely ignored by the IMF. But what you see in those pictures is a very peculiar, illustration of a way of treating Syria quite unlike I've seen before. There was a scheduled meeting in the White House calendar for 11 a.m. No schedule for the meeting in the cabinet room, which followed. In the cabinet room, which followed, there were no place cards on the table. That means almost all foreign dignitary or foreign leader meetings in the cabinet room have place cards so that each side can understand who they're talking to, especially the president. So what we also see from the photographs is an attempt to militarize the discussions. In the Oval Office, General Kane, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Peter Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, were both in the second row. That means that military objectives of the United States were under discussion. What's the first military objective? Get the Russians out of their bases in Syria. Prevent Russia from having a significant military role to play in Syria, and to prepare Syria as a platform for potential US attack on Iran again. So there are all those elements, money and military objectives, which were kept covert. No, you can't have a communique to say you're interested or even talking about that. You can't have a press conference or a press gaggle. There would be nothing for Trump to say. Even in the picture you showed, you see Trump reading from a script on his desk. That means that the arrangements were carefully orchestrated to make it appear to be cordial. It was. Military, they don't want to discuss. Money, investment, and writing off Iranian and Russian debt, that's another area of interest, but there's no sign of the US officials required to deal with that. So I would call al-Jilani's visit one of your first state covert visits. It's a sign of the US trying to develop in Syria a platform for achieving covert goals against its enemies.
Yeah. John, how Syria, it seems to me that is becoming so much complicated for all the players in Syria, mostly for the
Yes.
United States, Turkey, and Israel. But when you look at Russia today in Syria, what can they do in Syria to just counter what the United States is trying to do to make in that region?
Not a lot would be the short answer. What the 2 or 3 basic Russian objectives would be are clear in almost all the statements that have been made since February, when President Putin had his first telephone call with al-Shara al-Jolani. The Russian side wants to keep its naval base at Tartus and its air base at Khmeimim. It doesn't say so, but it would like to recover some of the debt. It's been estimated at somewhere between 30 billion and 50 billion combined, the repayment of which would have been understood to be partly in resources, concessions for the development, Russian-Syrian development of oil, phosphates, and fertilizers, and other forms of resources, and to preserve a Russian diplomatic base, let's say, that would induce the Syrian leadership, al-Jolani today, who knows tomorrow, to preserve Russia's position, blocking Turkey from coming further south, Israel from moving further north, and the United States moving from east to west. In other words, Syria is now a cockpit of conflict, because neither Israel is happy with Turkey's advances in Syria. Turkey is not happy with Israel. You've got this triangular partition into which Russia wants to play the spoiler as best it can. That's emphasized when President Putin has said, and he said, I'm looking down at my notes to see exactly what he said on February 15, the first telephone call. The Russian side emphasized its principal position in support of the Syrian state's unity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. Essentially, that means we're not happy with the partition, and we'll do our best to support any movement in Syria that would neutralize Israel, Turkey, and the United States. And that's the position it's hanging out. Second, it wants to maintain enough good relations with al-Jolani that he would see a value for himself in balancing the three, in preserving Tartus and Khmeimim, the bases. Russia is not going to speak of contesting Syria against Turkey, is it? Turkey and Syria, Turkey and Russia are significant allies. They have not been so in the run-up to the overthrow of the Assad regime, and it's a discrete and subtle conflict there. There's another issue, and that's been one of the fundamental concerns that Russia has had. Russia does not want to see Syria become a training base for Islamic fundamentalists and jihadis to be parachuted back into the Russian Caucasus. Neither Chechen terrorism or any other form of anti-Russian terrorism that has been in the past a US-supported, British-supported covert operation against Russia. Russia wants to maintain a position in Syria. Therefore, it needs a relatively strong Damascus government to crush any one of those types of movements. Those are the objectives of Russia. Now, we've seen a telephone call in February. We saw another Kremlin message in March. In July, end of July, Foreign Minister Lavrov went to Damascus and met with his counterpart, al-Shaibani, the foreign minister. He was visible in the picture in the Oval Office you saw, and explicitly said he was preparing back in July for a visit of al-Jolani to the Kremlin. And I'll just read you that Lavrov said in July, Russia expects interim president of the Syrian Arab Republic, Ahmed al-Shara, to take part in the first Russia League of Arab States summit, which is scheduled for October 15. Now, we all know, we've talked about it, that summit didn't materialize. Trump and the Israelis, but principally Trump, trumped the others by having the Sharm el-Sheikh Arab Summit to celebrate the so-called peace deal on Gaza. And that prevented the Arabs going on to Moscow the same week. Instead, al-Jolani showed up in Moscow without the rest of the Arab leadership. And so that brought us to the stage where President Putin openly endorsed the election in Damascus and openly endorsed al-Jolani. But if we understand why, you understand these served Russian purposes, and part of those purposes has been to neutralize the United States, Turkey, and Israel. Though, let's just say Russian policy towards Israel in Syria has been, to say euphemistically, ambiguous.
You remember Donald Trump in his first term, he wanted to withdraw from Syria. And even Trump in this new administration, he was talking about it, withdrawing from Syria. There is no point to stay there. And right now they're literally talking about sending troops to Syria. They're sending troops to Syria in an air base close to Damascus. How is that related to the conflict, or maybe the Middle East being somehow pregnant with new wars? That's why the United States needs to be in Syria to support Israel.
Well, pardon me. I think you make good points there. Let me respond this way. Trump represents a kind of external aggressive line, the obliteration line, the liquidation line. And he also represents the more money line. Let's just say those are the two goals he most often repeats as jingles, as slogans, as mottos, wherever he goes. So below his level of understanding and control, there are complex covert operations, as we began with, basically run by the CIA, headed by Director Ratcliffe, unaffected by anything Tulsi Gabbard has to say or do as DCI. And that's a level at which operations continue, develop, without Trump monitoring, knowing, until they're over or until they're well matured. They're based on a simple Trump agreements, which are fed down the line to operations of all kinds. So when I don't believe that Trump's idea of withdrawing US troops from Syria conforms with the underlying covert operation goals that we've just spelled out. Equally, he's not going to put US troops into Syria and expose them to any physical danger any more than he's willing to do the same in the Ukraine battlefield or between Azerbaijan and Armenia. He will find ways of putting in US commercial investment, and then attached to that, yes, possibly mercenaries, commercial protection mechanisms with a backup at sea in the Mediterranean or elsewhere. Is the United States using its position in Syria to protect Israel? In a manner of speaking, yes. But is there a coordination between Israel and the United States to use Syria as a platform for attacking Iran? Much more, yes. That would be, in my judgment, the priority, one of the priorities. And remember what I said, that General Kane was at the meetings with al-Jolani. We saw somebody representing the Central Command playing basketball with Jolani before the meetings at the White House. His visit was accompanied by a great amount of US military escort at a very high rank. And that means that the US wants to establish Syria as a platform for operations. And who are the enemies? Well, Israel is not the enemy, is it?
Yeah.
Iran's the enemy. Russia is the enemy. Iraq, no, not an enemy. But it's essential from a Central Command point of view, from a General Kane Joint Chiefs of Staff point of view, to make sure that Syria does not threaten these fundamental US military objectives. Now, this, oddly enough, is not very different from the way the US saw Syria in the 1940s, when the enemy was the Soviet Union. The money interest was oil and oil pipelines from Saudi Arabia to the Mediterranean. I documented that, told that story in the Jackal's Wedding book, which was published a couple of years back. So I hope that answers the question. The Trump concern is at Trump's level, make Syria a platform against our enemies, principally Iran, make Syria pay profits. And for that, Ambassador Barracks on the front line.
Looking at the behavior of al-Jilani and his people, it reminds me of the foreign policy of Turkey. And they're trying to play both sides, Russia and the United States. But
Yes.
don't you think that it's all about the Turkey and in the intelligence of Turkey being behind what's going on in Syria? Because I don't see al-Jilani and his people that much influential, that much powerful in Syria. And even we did, going to Russia, talking with the Russian president, it seems to me that they all planned it in Turkey. It wasn't planned in Syria by the al-Jilani and his people.
Well, you're right again. There's no doubt that al-Jilani was funded by Qatar in part, but organized, planned, directed, and controlled by Turkey. And without Turkish arms, without Turkish direction, without Turkish protection, al-Jilani's drive out of Idlib southwards could not have occurred. So that was a Turkish operation. Russia understood that from the beginning and anticipated that. The decision on the Russian side not to contest the Turkish aid to and planning for and encouragement of al-Jilani's drive towards Damascus. That was a seriously argued and contested decision-making process in Russia between October and December of last year. The problem for Russia, I'm obliged to speak from where I sit, you understand, is that Turkey is a strategic ally in continuing the war against Europe, the United States and NATO on the Ukraine battlefield, and resisting the sanctions war. Losing Turkey as an ally in that would be a much bigger loss to be risked for Moscow, for the Kremlin, than losing Syria was. And so the Russian approach has to be extremely careful. Let's say a balancing approach, a spoiler approach. That's the way it must be. You're right, Nima, to describe Jilani as playing a kind of balancing role. But you see, from his point of view, I would understand his attempt to obtain as many allies as he can for his, let's call it, Syrian Arab identity, because that gives him some leverage against the men who control him, the Turkish men who control him. And the more he can show support from Putin on the one hand, Trump on the other, the more he can demonstrate a Russian military presence in Syria and a US military presence, including playing basketball with them, the more he can represent to President Erdogan in Ankara the ambition that what was once their client is now a grown-up and potentially independent. And if you were him, wouldn't you do the same?
The other point is that they want to use Syria, or maybe somehow they may attack Lebanon from the northern part of Lebanon. I don't know how is that possible, but how do you see this concept that Israel would attack Lebanon and the United States would attack Iran? Is that, you've
Well,
mentioned that the possibility of war with Iran is just not that high right now, but how about,
postponed.
how about Israel attacking Lebanon and the United States attacking Iran? Is that going to be a possibility?
Well, again, I have to plead that I'm based in Moscow, so I see it from there. You have a better grip on how Iran sees these things. Let's just say Israel is making attacks on southern Lebanon almost all the time. Small tactical operations, slightly bigger ones, more reach, less reach. And the Lebanese sources I have, who are all outside the country or who have homes inside the country, describe a constant process of Israeli pressure. So let's just say, to the first part of your question, there is constant Israeli attacks on Lebanon. The second part of your question, is it conceivable that Turkey would reach down southwards and attack Lebanon from the north? Did I understand you correctly? Well, in trying to analyze back in December in my website, Dances with Bears, so forgive me for audience who wants to see what I knew then compared to what you're asking me now. There was a clear, and has always been a clear, Turkish interest in recovering the Ottoman provinces, the Ottoman territories along the Mediterranean coast, southwards, from Alexandria southwards. There was a clear argument in Moscow of whether there was a military scope to defend the Syrian Mediterranean shore from Khmeimim southwards to the Lebanese border against a Turkish advance, viewing Jalani's movement as a Turkish one. Let's just say, from a Turkish point of view, as it's interpreted in Moscow, and I'd be interested to know if you agree from an Iranian point of view. From a Turkish point of view, establishing Turkish control over the Mediterranean shore is a very valuable strategic gain from moving southwards. Does Turkey need to attack Lebanon? No. Can it put pressure on the north of Lebanon as it controls the north of Cyprus and makes the Eastern Mediterranean a Turkish sea? Well, that's long been an Erdogan strategic objective. And some in our audience will know the Turkish literature on making the Eastern Mediterranean a Turkish sea. And that stretches strategically all the way to Libya. So I think you're right. There's a Turkish ambition to control and dominate the Eastern Mediterranean. Israel gets in the way, of course. But it doesn't, I think the ambition is currently not expressed as a territorial attack on Lebanon. No, not that. And that's the advantage tactically of weak regimes like Jalani's, that it can seek US support to deter the Turks, it can seek Turkish support to deter the Israelis, and so on. That's a game the Syrians have been playing ever since Syria came into being and emerged out of French imperial control.
I think the whole West Asia, the conflict in the West Asia cannot be explained without considering the war in Ukraine. Because it seems to me, looking at the big picture of what's going on, it's all related to what's going on in Ukraine. And it doesn't seem that the United States at this particular moment is thinking of putting an end to the war in Ukraine anytime soon. What is your perception on the policy in Washington? Do they really want to put an end to the conflict, or the policy is the continuation? The way they're playing in the West Asia, it shows me that they want to weaken, even in Syria, they want to weaken Russia in the region.
Yes.
What's your take on that?
Well, let's try and take it piece by piece. On the one hand, the acceleration of the Russian advance has to be acknowledged, and it's not to repeat all the other podcasters whom you've had to explain how the Russian advance by land is accelerating. The Russian ability to inflict rising casualty rates against the Ukrainian defenders and force greater and greater surrender. This is also accelerating. The electric war campaign, which I've been documenting, which our audience can see on Dances with Bears, and one can see brand new pieces coming out yesterday and today in the Moscow press. The electric war campaign is basically saying to the Ukraine, you will have to choose, with winter coming up, between having the lights on and no heat, or heat on, no lights. On the one part of the electric war campaign, which is escalating, the momentum is sustained. Unlike 2022 October when it started, October 2023 when it resumed, President Putin is not now restricting the scope of the electric war, but there is a political condition to it. Close in the eastern regions, so Kharkov, Poltava, Sumy regions, are very badly hit because they represent the capacity to maintain reserves and stocks of arms and supplies into the fighting line. Destroy that, you destroy the electricity, destroy the power, you increase the likelihood of the collapse along the line. Yes? Further westward, the electric war campaign is forcing especially cities like Kiev to choose between light and heat, and to understand that a political solution to relieve this pressure requires a negotiation with the Russian side on Russian terms, not General Kellogg's version of European Union Zelensky terms. The electric war has that political message, and for the time being, there's no sign that the Ukrainians will consent. So the Russian advance in those two particular ways also seems to be endorsed by Trump's remarks. He's repeatedly said, and I've tried to record this in the Dances with Bears print, that he's saying, maybe we have to let them fight it out. He has repeatedly used that phrase. Maybe we have to let them fight it out. That's understood in Moscow as an encouragement for an accelerated offensive westward, not to hazard Russian casualties, but to accelerate the electric war, to accelerate the land advances, to, as it were, make whole the entire 4 regions, and drive further and further deeper away the Ukrainian, NATO, British, French, German, and American capability to hit the Russian hinterland with drones and missiles. So Trump seems to be saying, get on with it, finish it quickly. He seems to be implying, I'm giving up on ceasefire. He's giving up on that C word, which was an emphasis 2 weeks ago when the Budapest summit was cancelled, and instead choosing the other C word, capitulation. Capitulation, what does that mean? And let's get on to that, because that's a covert operation in which the US, the British, and others are deeply involved. Does Zelensky retain political power? Yes. We know that the British seem to favor a successor like General Zaluzhny, the ambassador currently in London. We read, both in the Ukrainian media and in the alt media in the United States and in Moscow commentaries, that the US may favor a return to power of Poroshenko. And Poroshenko, the former president, is said to be one of the drivers in Kiev of the current anti-corruption campaign that's attacking Zelensky's allies, particularly Timur Mindich and German Galushenko, a former energy minister, now a justice minister, and Dmitry Basov, the head of Energoatom, the Ukrainian utility. The current anti-corruption campaign focuses on the diversion of something like 10 to 15% of some of the foreign aid that's poured into protecting and rebuilding and repairing the Ukrainian ability to resist the electric war. I'm surprised, having followed Ukrainian corruption for many years, that the commission or the skim rate was only 10 to 15%. I would have expected it to be up to 30%, but 10 to 15% is a very large sum of money. And the aim is here to use this investigation of energy construction contract corruption to destroy Zelensky. At the same time, we're aware that there are campaigns of various kinds to capitulate in the general staff, so that General Syrski would be replaced by one of a number of candidates, all of whom are closely connected with the Azov movement. Okay, now I'm in no position, and there are Russian commentaries, the Ukrainian commentaries are in no position to say what the covert operation of CIA, MI6, and other powers are, what they're doing, what they think they're doing to rebuild or prepare the general staff for capitulation and continuation. That would be one thing. It is the Azov movement, the neo-Nazi base in the Ukraine, already understands the war's finished, the war will be lost, and they're preparing a base, a command structure, a fallback position, based in Lvov, perhaps based between Kiev and Lvov, that would be their continuing ability to defend, draw money from the West, continue the war against Russia. These are covert operations to potentially change the Ukrainian regime that looks like capitulation at the beginning, but represents continuation of the war against Russia for the future. Now, that's long and complicated because they are political complications. There are military complications as the country faces lights out or heat out and the destruction of its capacity to function during this winter. We then have covert operations, the details of which we can guess at, but we can't understand exactly what US policy would be. As we say, the US policy that Trump says is very simple. He can only utter simple slogans. Let them fight it out. Well, suppose they do fight it out and Russia wins. What's he going to say then? And that's where we are now. We're in a transition between giving up the idea of winning and accepting that what will come out of the wreckage will be the Russian terms and a base for fighting the war continuously in the future. That's a lot of podcasts to come, but not
Yeah,
now,
yeah,
tonight.
yeah, exactly. John, how does Russia see the Ukrainian army in the aftermath of any settlement in Ukraine? An army without heavy weapons, I'm talking about the tanks, the long range missiles, short range missiles that can
Yes.
reach the Russian territory, and fighter jets. How is that going to be? How do they see, how do they want the Ukrainian side?
Well, the Russian side's been very clear in the 32-point plan for peace settlement to end the war, which was tabled in Istanbul at the beginning of June, and we've spoken of it many times. The details have to be negotiated, but they're not being negotiated. There's never been any attempt by the United States to recognize those terms or negotiate with. There's never been a Ukrainian one. There's never been a British, French, German readiness to negotiate on those terms. But you ask me, what are the terms? Well, a demilitarized zone deep enough to protect Russia from a resumption of long range drone or long range missile attacks, either on the Novorossiya, the 4 regions in Crimea, or further into the hinterland of Russia as is being attacked now. No intelligence sharing, no targeting, no operational involvement of any NATO power in the Ukraine. So all foreign staffs, intelligence operatives, military planners, all of that has to be removed. NATO cannot have a position in the Ukraine. It's not simply the Ukraine promises not to join NATO. It's already de facto a NATO warfighting platform. So the Russian position is all foreign forces removed. That leaves a self-defense capability on the Ukrainian territory that would have police functions, security functions with, let's call them relatively light weapons for policing and securing the remaining territory. Now, that's never been accepted, and it still isn't being accepted by anyone on the US side or the European side or the NATO side. But it would be a rump defending itself from itself, essentially a police function. Between that policed entity, there'd be a demilitarized zone into which no heavy weapons or drone capability could be launched at Russia. And then you'd come to the Western line, marking the 4 regions or the new Russia regions of Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson, plus Crimea. That's it. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, John, I want to get back to the policy of regime change. We had in a terror attack in Delhi in India,
Yes.
and how could you bring that to the picture, to the big picture of what's going on with the Trump administration and the policy of regime change? And It's somehow amazing to me that Donald Trump was before being elected, he was criticizing this sort of policy of regime change, and right now he's literally doing
Yes,
whatever he was criticizing before, and he's it seems to me the main face of you know why are we every time we talk about George Soros, this sort of movement, USAID, he was criticizing because of the policy of regime change, but he's
yes,
doing this by force, by everything at his disposal. Your take on
yes.
what's going on in India and why India is important? Why is that important for the big picture?
Well, let's, for the audience that may not be familiar, in the last 48 hours, uh, the there was a car bomb explosion near the Red Fort in Old Delhi. Um, the car, um, its occupants, um, appear to have been, and this is a tribute to the speed at which Indian security forces and investigations have identified the source, the organization behind. The car seems to have been part of a planned terrorist operation of a group known as Jaish-e-Mohammed, JEM, which has its base and military support in Pakistan. What seems the three individuals in the car were killed, and at least 6 other bystanders killed in this attack. I've been consulting with Indian sources, some of whom caution that while the investigation is underway and clearly identifies the JEM organization, pardon me, Jaish-e-Mohammed, as the involved, there are many questions still unanswered. But let me try and give you, pardon me, what seems to have been happened. On the one hand, the Indian security forces were able to arrest and seize very large, nearly 3 tons, nearly 3,000 kilograms of high explosive, RDX, and other types of explosive in the days and hours preceding the Red Fort bombing incident. They were all Jaish-e-Mohammed JEM group members, and though they had suffered significant losses during India's war with Pakistan earlier in the year, in April and May, they were resuming operations, and that's important. It's unusual for either a Pakistan-supported terrorist group to resume operations after such a defeat, after such a recent defeat. Those people and some of their leaders have been encouraged, they have said, by the apparent resumption of the US relationship with Pakistan, and they've said so publicly. This raises a very important question whether this JEM operation misfired at the time, and I'll come back to how that seems to have happened, but had an underlying operational and strategic objective that, and this is a question mark, was it encouraged by Pakistan with the belief that it had US support for these types of operations to weaken the Modi government in India? Now, a couple of points. It appears at this moment that because of the alertness and effectiveness of the Indian security forces and the capture of a very large cache of explosive a couple hours before this operation, these individuals were panicked into moving their car filled with ammonia nitrate. I'm not sure what the chemicals were, and there's been no official announcement. Were the chemicals RDX, was the explosive RDX, or was it some other form of explosion? That won't take too long before that's publicly announced in India. Were they panicked into acting because the organization was increasingly under arrest, its arms caches and its explosive caches seized? Did they act in panic? Were they deliberately targeting the Red Fort, a symbol of Indian independence? Or were they capable of moving anywhere else? Did the explosives um, go off by accident, or was it calculated? These are uncertainties now, but here's a couple of important points for our audience to understand. First, the big question in India, all my sources are asking it. It's being asked and discussed. Was this revival of JEM operations in India encouraged by Pakistan? Because Pakistan is encouraged to believe, emboldened, you might say, by the close relationship President Trump has developed with Asim Munir, the head of the Pakistan military and the de facto head of Pakistan. Was there a link of that kind? Question mark. Second, timing. Why did this happen then? Why was this organization primed and ready to operate? What's the significance of now? Now, November, what are we? 11.
11. Yeah.
The big event coming in India is December 6th, and that's the state visit of President Putin to meet Prime Minister Modi in Delhi. Was there to be an operation against President Putin's visit to Delhi? The closeness, the significance of the Russian visit to Delhi, all of these are important questions being asked right now in Delhi. And I'm only giving you the beginnings of answers. And I'm hoping that you and our audience understand the questions relate to the question you asked. Is Pakistan emboldened by Trump to increase the pressure on India? Is India considered by elements of the Trump administration, the covert operators of the Trump administration, the military commands of the Trump administration? Is India seen to be a potential ally against the United States interests, as China is considered to be a target? We've seen President Trump having extremely friendly relations with Prime Minister Modi. My sources say that from an Indian point of view, there's a belief that President Trump is jealous of Prime Minister Modi, that the Prime Minister has the capacity to resist the United States. Resistance of the United States in trade war, in military terms, is shown by Russia, Iran, Venezuela, China, and India. These are the major forms of resistance to, let's call it, the Trump doctrine of obliteration and the covert US operations for regime change. We've mentioned obliteration, we've emphasized regime change. Is this attack maybe an accidental detonation, but part of a preparation that was aimed at damaging India's relationship with Russia on the eve of or during President Putin's visit? These are powerful questions. They raise important question marks on the point you raise. Why is the United States continuing its aggressive regime change strategy? And to what extent is this endorsed by President Trump?
Yeah. John, just to wrap up this session, today is, as you mentioned, is November 11th. is the 50th anniversary of the regime changing coup, which replaced the elected government in Australia
Yes.
and is known as the dismissal. But
Yes.
it was during the Carter presidency, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
It well, in November 11, 1975, Gerald Ford was president, and this is the 50th anniversary so for many Australians listening, this is a very serious day to remember. Let me say a couple of things about why it's of global significance, because when Jimmy Carter came to power in
It was that, yeah, before.
yes, what the Carter administration did was something that had never been done before. In July of 1977, so Jimmy Carter was now president for about 6 months, he sent Deputy Secretary of State Warren Christopher to Sydney to meet the deposed Prime Minister Gough Whitlam and apologize to Whitlam personally, with the promise that the CIA, that the Carter administration apologized for interfering with the dismissal and with the plan to topple Gough Whitlam's government in 1975, and promised not to do it again. As it turns out, and the CIA was at that very moment plotting another operation in Australia, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But it's never happened before that I'm aware of, that a US president apologized for a CIA operation to topple a government, let alone a friendly government. Second, the dismissal of November 11, 1975, for folks who don't follow Australian politics, involved the Governor General, Sir John Kerr at the time, dismissing the elected Prime Minister, Labor Party Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, installing a Conservative Party of Malcolm Fraser as the Prime Minister, who would then supervise the election, dismiss Parliament, and then win the next election, which established the Fraser government, the Conservative majority in Parliament. The dismissal involves Kerr's actions, which Whitlam had a variety of options and a variety of advanced knowledge that it was coming. But for many Australians currently discussing it, and for many Australians who discussed it at the time, and there's a lot of argument about what Whitlam could have done, should have done, and so forth. But what is very interesting now for our audience, we've talked about Venezuela, we've talked about Iran, we've talked about Syria, we've talked about regime change in Russia. These US objectives, implemented covertly or militarily, were pursued in Australia. There is a very great reluctance on the part of Australian media to acknowledge that the CIA played any role at all. And the fact that the Carter administration apologized is not noted in any of the current press coverage. There was the first dismissal. Let me explain it that way. The second dismissal is not discussed at all. By 1977, Kerr, as a Governor General, represented a deep polarization and split in the Australian electorate. And he himself had become alcoholic. He could not cope with the job. And he had to be replaced. That was understood in the Fraser government. It was understood in the US government and in the British government. Each of them play influence in Canberra. What I know to have been the case is that the second dismissal was a scheme to remove Kerr and replace him with a new governor general. This part I know because the new governor general, Zelman Cowen, was my mother's brother, my uncle. And I very rarely write or talk about that individual. We were not on good terms. He's dead now. And my mother's requirement of me never to say what I knew about Zelman Cowen ended when my mother died in 2017. Zelman Cowen was the selection of the United States government and the CIA for governor general. How do I know? Because Malcolm Fraser told me that we had a meeting in his retirement. I'm just looking up the dates. And I was sworn not to repeat what had been said. And he died 2 years later. So that promise ended with him. But essentially, Fraser said he had never heard of Zelman Cowen before he called him to Canberra to meet and said, I'm appointing you Governor General. I asked Fraser if you'd never heard him or heard of him. He was a university professor, vice chancellor of a university. Why did you pick him? He said to me that the choice of Cowen didn't come from him. And he was very vague as to where it came from. Consequently, for the last 10 years or so, and in U.S. federal court in Washington, I have been seeking the state and CIA documents relating to Zelman Cowen from before 77 through his entire governor generalship. They refused to hand them over. The man's dead. I've lost the court case, which went to Court of Appeal in District of Columbia. And the only documents ever released about Zelman Cowen relate to the menus at state dinners and where officials should stand when significant U.S. officials arrive. The reluctance of the US to release information about that Australian is not matched by others. There have been great releases of Robert Hawke, an Australian prime minister, who was an informer for the FBI, an informer for the State Department. This is a common occurrence in the Australian government's history. So, to sum it up very quickly, what was unique about the Australian case was first the CIA apologized and then began to plot the Governor General dismissal, which it succeeded in achieving first. And second, when Australians discuss, as they have on this anniversary, could it happen again? The answer is it doesn't need to. The great success of US intervention in Australian politics has been to make the Australian Labor Party and the Conservative or National Liberal Party so subservient to the United States, so trusted and controllable from a US point of view, you don't need to dismiss anybody anymore. And that's a level of success of penetrating a government, which some of our audience might recognize in Europe, certainly in Greece. Some of our audience might recognize in the Americas. And what do we have against it? What do we have as resistant? Well, we have Iran. We have Russia. We have India. We have China. We have the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. We have Venezuela. These are the resisting countries which aren't covert operations successes the way it was in Australia.
Yeah. Thank you so much, John, for being
Thank you
with
for
us
having
today.
me. And we'll see you next week, and we'll see what exciting secrets spill out in the countries we've just been discussing.
Yeah. Thank you.